Ask when humans first drank alcohol, and you get a story about a cave. 13,000 years ago, in the hills above the eastern Mediterranean coast. Someone leaves crushed grain sitting in a stone bowl. Rain gets in. Days pass. It bubbles. It smells strange. Someone tastes it anyway. It is a good story. It is also the wrong answer. Not because the cave is fake. The cave is real, and we will get to it. By the time anybody stood in it, our bodies had handled this molecule for millions of years. Long before the first cup, long before the first pot, long before us. The taste was not the discovery. Here is the part almost every version of this story gets backwards. Alcohol did not wait for humans to invent it. It is made constantly, everywhere, by an organism with no interest in us at all. Sugar plus yeast makes ethanol. That reaction has been running for 100 million years. Every forest floor with fallen fruit on it is a brewery running without a brewer. So the real question is not when we first tasted it. The question is when we stopped finding it and started making it. That switch is the whole story, and it is far younger than you think. It also turned out to be one of the most consequential things our species ever did. Start 10 million years ago, in a forest, with an ape that is not yet us. Fruit ripens high in the canopy. Some of it falls. On the ground it splits open. Sugar leaks out. Wild yeast lands on it. Within a day or two, that sugar is turning into ethanol. The fruit is now mildly alcoholic, usually somewhere near 1%. Weak, but the strength is not the point here. The smell is. Ethanol evaporates quickly and travels a long way through open air. A fallen fruit broadcasts its own location on the wind. Any animal that can follow that signal finds concentrated calories. There is only one problem with the prize. Ethanol is a poison. For most animals, a real dose is somewhere between miserable and fatal. Their bodies simply cannot take the molecule apart fast enough. Which is where our own line does something unusual. Around 10 million years ago, one gene in our ancestors changes. It builds an enzyme that sits in the mouth, the throat, and the gut. A single change reshapes it, and the enzyme suddenly grips the molecule properly. After that change, the same body clears ethanol roughly 40 times faster. That is not a small improvement. That is a different relationship with the molecule. And the timing lines up with something else in the fossil record. This is the stretch when our ancestors spend far more time down on the ground. On the ground is where the fallen fruit is. On the ground is where the fermenting happens. Scientists even gave the idea a name. The drunken monkey hypothesis. The name is unserious. The evidence behind it is not. In Panama, researchers followed monkeys eating fruit that had dropped and gone soft. They tested the fruit itself. It was fermenting at 1 to 2%. Then they tested the animals and found the breakdown products in their bodies. The monkeys were not sampling it by accident. It was ordinary food. In Malaysia, a small tree shrew feeds on palm flower nectar that ferments where it sits. That nectar reaches almost 4%, and the animal feeds from it nightly. It does not stagger. It does not stop. It simply processes the stuff. So mild fermentation is not exotic in nature. It is part of the menu. Now ask what that ancient mutation actually bought our ancestors. It was not a feeling. It was access. A fallen fruit is a pile of calories that most animals have to walk away from. Past ripe, on the ground, quietly filling with something toxic. Our line could eat it safely, hours after everything else had given up on it. In a hungry season, that is not a luxury. That is a survival window. So we did not acquire this taste. We inherited it. By the time modern humans exist, the preference is already ancient hardware. But eating fermented fruit is still not brewing. An animal finds. It does not make. Making it on purpose needs 4 things, and all 4 are difficult. You have to notice that one specific change improves one specific food. You have to remember the exact conditions that caused it. You have to reproduce those conditions deliberately, on purpose, again. And then you have to wait and guard it while nothing useful appears to happen. That last step is the hardest. Waiting is expensive when food is short. So the first deliberate batch is not really a recipe. It is a change in how people handle time. Which brings us back to that cave. Raqefet Cave sits in the Mount Carmel range in northern Israel. 13,000 years ago, it was used by hunter-gatherers who had begun staying in one place. It was a burial place, and cut straight into the stone floor are mortars. One is deep and narrow, sunk into bedrock, large enough to hold several kilos of grain. Researchers scraped out the residue and put the starch under a microscope. The grains were damaged in a very specific and very telling way. Swollen, pitted, partly dissolved, distorted exactly the way sprouted, heated, fermented starch is. That pattern implies 3 separate stages, carried out in order. Sprout the grain and dry it. Heat it and mash it, then leave it alone to work. 3 stages, with waiting in between. That is a process, not an accident. It is the oldest evidence we have anywhere for making something like beer. Now the honest part, because this channel always does the honest part. Not every archaeologist accepts the interpretation. Damaged starch can also come from ordinary cooking or simply from time. The find is published, tested, and argued over, which is what a real result looks like. Hold it as the strongest current candidate, not as a closed case. And notice where it was found, not in a kitchen, in a place for the dead. Whatever was made there was made for a gathering. Several hundred miles north, that same idea turns up on a far larger scale. Göbekli Tepe, in southern Turkey, raised about 11,500 years ago. Carved stone pillars set in rings, built by people who were not yet farmers. Building that took crowds, and crowds have to be fed. Among the stones are limestone vats, the largest holding well over 100 liters. Inside some of them, chemical traces of the kind that fermenting grain leaves behind. Not proof of a brewery, a strong hint at one. And it supports an idea that reverses the usual order of history. We are taught that farming came first, and that everything else followed from it. Grain, then surplus, then settlement, then feasting, then culture. Göbekli Tepe suggests the sequence might run the other way around. Gathering first, feasting first, and only then a hard need for reliable grain. Under that reading, the demand for the drink arrives before the farm does. Some of the earliest domesticated wheat on Earth grows within sight of that hilltop. It is a hypothesis, not a verdict, and serious people argue both sides of it. But it puts fermentation somewhere unexpected, not a product of civilization. Possibly one of the pressures that produced it. Either way, once grain and pottery exist together, this thing spreads everywhere at once. 9,000 years ago, at a village called Jiahu in central China, pottery jars there hold traces of rice, honey, and fruit work together in one batch. 8,000 years ago, in the South Caucasus, in what is now Georgia, clay jars from a farming village carry the acid signature that grapes leave behind. It is the earliest confirmed grape wine found anywhere in the world. Georgians still make it that way, in huge clay vessels buried up to the neck in the ground. An unbroken technique, 8,000 years long. Then writing appears, and the story stops being chemistry and becomes paperwork. In Mesopotamia, some of the very earliest tablets are ration lists. Workers were paid in grain and in a daily jar allowance, measured out by the day. A hymn from around 1800 BCE walks through the entire process, step by step. It is a song to a goddess and a working recipe at the same time. In the law code of Hammurabi, the drinking houses get clauses of their own. Prices are fixed. Watering down the product is an offense with a penalty attached. Consumer protection law, written into one of the first legal codes we have. Egypt industrialized it. Rows of vats, set into the ground, built to supply hundreds. Pyramid workers were issued bread in jars as standard, ordinary pay. And there is a practical reason it was everywhere, which has nothing to do with pleasure. Fermenting a batch makes it hostile to the organisms that spoil food and cause disease. It preserved calories that would otherwise have rotted away in a week. In a crowded settlement with no clean supply, that was a genuine advantage. For most of history, this was food and safety first, and everything else a distant second. Then something remarkable happens. The technology starts editing us back. Somewhere between 10 and 7,000 years ago, in East Asia, a gene variant spreads. It changes the second enzyme in the chain, the one that clears the toxic middle step. In people who carry it, that harmful middle product builds up fast. The result is flushing, a racing heartbeat, and immediate discomfort. It is common today across large parts of East Asia. And it spreads during the same window as intensive rice growing and rice fermenting. A gene that makes the stuff unpleasant became more common while the stuff became more available. One reading is that it was protective, and selection quietly favored the people it protected, which is the clearest signal in this whole story about what we are actually dealing with. Our tolerance is an old workaround for a toxin. It was never a license. 10 million years of adaptation bought us a margin. It did not remove the cost. So, when did ancient humans first drink alcohol? Taste it 10 million years ago, on a forest floor, long before anything human existed. Make it on purpose, around 13,000 years ago, on the best evidence we have. But the genuinely interesting answer is the third one. That second date is the first time our species successfully managed something invisible. Nobody could see yeast. Nobody would see it for another 12,000 years. And yet people learned to feed it, house it, time it, and keep it alive. Fermentation is biotechnology, run for millennia by people with no theory behind it at all. That is the real discovery here, not the drink, the method. We did not find alcohol. Alcohol was always here. What we found was that something too small to see would work for us if we were patient. And that one lesson went on to build a great deal more than a drink. If you want the rest of that story, the next video is already waiting for you.